Today we're talking about data and we're joined by the illustrious Patrick Murray
Hello.
and the inimitable James Croft.
Hello.
Now, do you want to start by introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about what you do here at Razor?
Yeah, cool. So I'm Patrick, I'm head of strategy at Razor. My job is to make sure all the cool tech that we're making for our clients not just makes sense now, but it also makes sense in 3 years' time when it's all part of their digital transformation project and making sure all those bits fit. But excited to be in our pretty cool looking studio in our cave and talking data.
And I'm James Croft, head of innovation at Razor, and I take what sort of Patrick's looking into in sort of the industry problems and then turning those into tech solutions to solve problems that we have today and then problems in the future, like this little guy up here.
Well, I wasn't going to mention it, but now you've brought it to our attention. What is the hat about?
So this is a knock sensing hard hat. So if you consider, if you think about a lone worker, they're on site, hit their head, knocked out. Well, the little gadgets on here, the little sort of Raspberry Pi on the back, there's a little accelerometer which is detecting that knock. So when someone bashes their head, we've got this little red light up here that's visual indicator, but it's sending an alert up to the cloud. It's sending that piece of data that at this point in time, this person who's wearing this helmet has knocked themselves unconscious, basically.
How many Raspberry Pis do we have in the office, do you think?
Too many. Although we are running short. The chip shortage in the world is causing us a bit of a headache, but we do have plenty around so that we.
How many is too many Raspberry Pis?
There isn't. I mean, at home I've at least got 3 or 4 just of my own, and that's not including work ones. So.
And so, where does that data go, and what can people get from it and use?
It's sending up to the cloud. So that data, it's just a small data point. This knock happened at this point in time. This specific helmet. So say if you had 20 or 30 helmets, all sending that data up, you can get a bit, get some insights out of that. How many times has Joe Bloggs knocked his head, knocked himself unconscious?
But I think that's a good example, though. I mean, I think it illustrates that you don't need lots and lots of data points to get quite a useful bit of insight from it. That's one person knocking their head, and that's all that needs to be, and that could save somebody's life quite easily. So I think it's a good illustration of how that's the case.
Absolutely. And is it only in the construction industry do you think that this is applicable, or could it be other industries?
The technology that's in there you could apply to literally anything. You could have that in a bicycle helmet. If you're off in the mountains somewhere, unconscious, send an alert out. There's so many applications for that piece of technology.
Good. I'd like to think that if you were knocked off your bike, you'd hopefully know about it before.
I don't know. It depends how unconscious you are.
This is very true. It's very true. Now, big data. What does it mean? What is it? And why is it better than small data?
So big data. Well, is it better than small data? Probably my question. I think something that data has never been short of is buzzwords. Yeah. And I don't know if you found the same thing. Big data isn't a new thing. It's been around for a long time. I think big data is interesting, it's important, it's, in a nutshell, getting value from lots and lots of data, but we're talking terabytes. And it's something that the Netflixes and the Amazons are getting tons of value from. Whenever you're going on Netflix and you see recommendation, here's what to watch next, that is big data in action. That's it. That's big data. Looking at your activity, comparing it to everybody else who uses Netflix, and saying this is where this person fits. This is the kind of thing they like. I think a lot of particular clients that we work in, it's important not to get hung up on the word big.
Yeah.
Now you asked me whether small data is better or worse. I think it's neither. I think it's as important. And if anyone listening to this, an important takeaway that I would say is that even a small amount of data, as we kind of illustrated with the helmet there, can still be valuable. It doesn't need to be big data. It can be just putting the right amount of insight, of information in the right person's hands, and that can be valuable. And it can start there. Big data can come later on, but I'd start there.
And what I'd add to that as well, I think people misinterpret what big data means. I think they think it means a lot of the same data. So say with that helmet, having millions of that specific kind of data point, but big data is about everything, about every piece of data. It's not just one thing. And it's bringing those sources of data together to be able to do something with it.
Interesting. And how can data, big or small, influence the decision-making process in industries?
Well, I think it's putting the right. It is putting the right data in the right person's hands. We talk a lot about if you've seen any of the numerous YouTube videos starring myself.
I've seen them all.
I've seen them all.
Yeah, big fan.
So you'll be as familiar as anybody with the what we call the DIKW pyramid: data, information, knowledge, wisdom. We talk about it a lot, and without the benefit of a nice slideshow to take you through. If you imagine a triangle, can you picture a triangle?
Yeah, I can just about picture a triangle. One of them, right?
Yeah. 3 points. But what it illustrates is that data is always sits at the bottom as a foundation, and it's important. It holds the whole thing up. But what you're interested in is the wisdom that you can get from it. That's the actionable insight. The way I always like to illustrate it is if you take an example of data, it could be something like red light. If I say the word red light, that could mean anything. It could be that neon sign. It could be anything. If I turn that into information by saying something like the red light on Sydney Street in Sheffield, the traffic light on Sydney Street in Sheffield has turned red. Now we're all on Sydney Street in Sheffield, but if you've never been there, you could still probably picture about the same thing. That becomes knowledge by being in the hands of someone who can take action on it. So a piece of knowledge would be, I'm driving on Sydney Street in Sheffield and the traffic light has turned red. That is now a piece of actionable insight that you can apply the wisdom to of, I should put the brakes on. Now that is a pretty silly example.
Yeah.
It might not be relevant to industry, but the concept still holds up. It's about understanding what are those bits of wisdom, what's the bit of actionable insight, and understanding the data you need to enable it. And that could be big or small. But it's important to start with that, and then you can go from there.
I mean, I think that's I think a lot of people try to gather a lot of information, not information, a lot of data, but don't know what to do with it. And even that data that they have might not be relevant to the problems they're trying to solve. And that's one of the problems with big data is that, what can we get? Let's get some of that. Let's pull it all together and do something with it, rather than thinking about what they can actually do with it.
And I've had that conversation. I've met people who've said, we've done data. We collect loads of data, but it's not very valuable. And you say, what are you doing with it? Oh, well, nothing. We just put it in a database, and then you've got to pay someone to look after it. You got to, and then when you finally do come to it, you've neglected it for a year, and it's all in a state, and you have to clean it, and you have to spend a load of money, and it's before you embark on whatever it is you're doing, it's thinking, what is the action? What's that one piece of, what's that question we want to answer right at the start?
Is that the first step then for businesses to understand what they want to do with it? Because I know data gets thrown around as a buzzword. We want to do something with data, we're not sure what we want to do. Is it having that actionable insight and identifying that first, starting from the top down?
It's as simple as that. I think for all the buzzwords, it's a pretty simple concept. It's record that thing, put it in the right person's hands, make a decision. What I always say when I'm having these conversations, really simple exercise. You sat in a meeting, leave an empty chair in the room. If sat in that chair was your data, what questions would you be asking to it?
Yeah.
Because that's your clue. That's your clue to the thing that you're trying to understand to solve the problems that you're actually facing. It's not data for data's sake. It's we're sitting here making these decisions every day, and this is having a real impact on what we do. If something or someone can answer this question, we'll make better decisions, and that tells you what you should be working on. It's as simple as that.
And once you know what it is that you're trying, those questions that you're trying to answer, that's when you go and get that data. You might already have some of it, but there may be bits of missing data that you need to answer that question. That's when you start making the change. Adding sensors to machines or whatever it might be to get that data out.
That's it.
Things are moving pretty fast with technology at the minute. Is it too late now for businesses to get started on their data journey?
Go on, innovation. What do you think?
No, I wouldn't say so. It's one of those things. I think where I'm going to go with this is probably a bit like left field, but adding another buzzword in. AI is booming again now with emergence of things like ChatGPT. All of those require data. So whether I'm not saying that people should go down the route of exploring AI right now, but if that helps you solve a problem that you're trying to get out the questions from your data. But you still need the data. You can't start from nothing with AI.
Now, you mentioned probably one of the biggest buzzwords, hot topics in data and technology at the minute, ChatGPT, OpenAI. Should we be worried?
No.
Or should we be excited?
You should be excited. You definitely should be excited. Is it going to take your jobs? No. It's meant to be an assistive tool. When I speak to clients, and we're talking about AI, I try to push that. It's an assistive tool, so that the people who are like doing those manual jobs now of trying to work out, predicting when a machine's going to break, it solves that problem so that you can focus on something else, something more important, more valuable. I'm not going to say it can't replace jobs. It can, but the idea is that you use it as an assistive tool rather than to actually fully replace it.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I think in if you look at previous revolutions, I suppose, industrial revolutions, we've had some kind of automation that has maybe taken some kind of manual job and replaced it. You might have some kind of farming machinery that does the work of 100 people. I think AI is an interesting one, and I don't know what your thoughts on this, James, but it affects a lot of different kinds of jobs. And I agree. I think it is absolutely it's an assistive tool that should make people better. I think it will be interesting in 20 years' time. I don't think it's going to be, okay, we don't need this developer now because we've got this AI tool.
Yeah.
But in a company that has 100 developers today, I'd be interested what you think is that 100 developers in 20 years' time?
I think it'll be 100 developers focused on something else. Part of the challenge that we have today is that the complexities in building any application is getting harder and harder, which is obviously adding more complexity. But I think if we can focus that down and use AI to solve those problems, the things that shouldn't be that hard, building a website, building an API, so that then these engineers will become data scientists.
It's not hard, is it, building a website?
It shouldn't be hard, that's the thing. It shouldn't be hard, but it can be.
We should have a go.
James Croft says your job is safe.
But I think with developing, building a website probably is quite hard for myself, and I don't know about you, Callum.
I'd give it a go.
But,
I can draw.
But that point notwithstanding, the hardest part of what I feel that we do is understanding a problem.
Yeah.
It's having the vision to how you get from where you're starting from to that problem being solved. That kind of problem, I don't think is as well suited to AI. AI can help write some code because you're working in pretty well-defined boundaries with that. And AI can be well trained on looking at a big data set of how that code might be written. But when you're starting to solve problems that require what humans are good at, creativity, more strategic thinking, dealing with uncertainty, that's when you're always going to need humans. I think ChatGPT has been a really interesting one, and we're getting tons and tons of people from all kinds of backgrounds, industries, levels of tech maturity.
Maybe we had a client find us via ChatGPT.
Yeah, that was one. So they put into ChatGPT, was it Sheffield companies who can work with AI?
The best Sheffield company.
The best Sheffield company. And a pop razor.
Yeah.
And then he talked about some interesting challenges, and he's probably the kind of person who we talked to all kinds of companies, but it wasn't talking to him. He wasn't the typical person who I'd expect to be asking us about something that is so cutting edge.
Yeah.
And it sort of shows the mainstream appeal that it's had. But ultimately, it's a big statistical language model. I think a lot of people, because you interact with it, and you can have quite, when you're conversing with it, you would think it is a person.
Yeah.
Like it's very, it's amazing. I find it amazing. But ultimately, it's a statistical model that is deciding which word comes next in a sentence.
Yeah.
Based on information that already exists.
It's pre-trained as well. That's one thing around GPT, which as a model, like an AI model, you couldn't use for specific scenarios in your own industry. It's good for like human readable content knowledge, but it's not going to be able to infer that your machine's going to break. It doesn't know that because it doesn't have that information. It's pre-trained on the internet of knowledge.
Who trained the model? Who trained the ChatGPT model?
So there's a company called OpenAI, and they basically research all of this this space. The data engineers, data scientists who are creating these models. So ChatGPT, which I think everybody's more familiar with, is just a surface layer for an AI called GPT. And GPT is the language model. And they're continuously iterating on it. I think just a couple of weeks ago, maybe last month, they introduced GPT-4, which is a newer, more advanced model than the previous one. And there's some interesting stuff that they do. I don't want to go too much into it, but some interesting research that they do around the AI, and then molding it before they actually put it out there for people to use.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was reading an article this morning, and I think it was a newspaper in Ireland was apologising because it turned out a piece that had been submitted to them had been generated through ChatGPT. I think there's an interesting question there around, does that matter? Would you think less of an article you were reading if you knew it had been written by a journalist or if it had been written by ChatGPT? Like, does it matter?
I think this is where it's an assistive tool and the two come together. Because if you're using that AI tool to just generate content, you're throwing it out there, you're not fact checking it, you don't know if it's correct. Everything that it's responding with is just an assumption based on the prompt you give it. And unless you're fully into your data sciences and you're doing prompt engineering, which is basically saying the right phrases to get the right answer, what it can generate could be absolute garbage.
Well, yeah, I don't know if you found that. I find, because I sometimes use it as basically a Google, alternative.
Yeah.
If I've got a question I want to answer, I just ask it to ChatGPT, and you're not digging through.
I also know that you've used it to create your own sitcoms.
It's not as funny as we are, obviously. As you get it from this, it's not got that.
Yeah.
But I find sometimes when it's something, when I ask it about a subject that I do know about, especially when I ask it to give me kind of a long form, detailed thing, there are elements where actually I don't know if that's quite
questionable.
But it says it in a very, very convincing way. I've not actually tried GPT-4.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've had a go with that.
Not yet. It's on a tech radar.
Tech radar.
Think of the sitcoms you could write with GPT.
Well, no, if this doesn't work out, that's on next.
You mentioned in your chat data engineers and data scientists. Can you just break down those roles and what they mean and what their sort of responsibilities are?
Yeah. So I think an often confused, often overlapped roles. I think people hire data professionals in some ways, and I think in some ways hope they kind of fulfill both roles. I'd say that in the most simplest way, to me, a data engineer is effectively a data plumber.
Mm-hmm.
It's the person who puts all the pipe work in and does all the work to get data from its raw, unrefined state, wherever it was made, into a place where it can be analysed. So we can talk more about those little bits look like, but that's what a data engineer does. A data scientist is, probably as the name suggests, a scientist. It's someone who asks questions about data and goes and finds the answer, who forms hypotheses, who does statistical analysis, and is very much more on that, machine learning, statistical modelling side of, we have a question about this data, let's go find out about it. But I think there are obviously roles that are massively in demand at the minute. We have our own, and ones that are often confused, but very, very distinct skill sets.
Your data scientist is the one that's probably creating your AI models, your machine learning models. That's how I tend to.
And your engineer is your plumber.
Is your plumber?
Exactly.
Yeah, you need data pipes and doing those together. So.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, you need that though. You do need the plumbing. The two are the complementary roles. You need both. You can't have one without the other.
Oh yeah, don't get me wrong. And again, it kind of goes back to what I said before about how we, the challenges we face when we're creating a piece of software. The tech is the tech. You can learn about the tech. The hard thing with data engineering is getting the data in a state that answers the right questions and understanding what those questions are, which links back to what we said before. Whenever you're doing a data transformation or trying to do things with data, they're the things you need to be thinking of. It's not just getting it from point A to point B, because that's when you do end up with well, I had a load of data I didn't understand here, and I've got it here. So what?
Yeah.
It's getting it in a form that right now we can, create the dashboards that that interrogates that data in the way we want to. We can ask the questions of it. So both important.
Talk about the applicability for data projects in certain industries. Something that comes up a lot, particularly in manufacturing, is sustainability. How can data projects be used to support sustainability?
Well, with sustainability, you can't improve something. You improve the things that you can measure, and you got to be able to measure what you're improving to know that the things that you're doing are having an impact. Data on its own won't make you more sustainable, but it can tell you the places that you need to start looking and going to look at those. Something like you sort of alluded to there, particularly in the manufacturing industry, particularly with what's happening with energy bills, how expensive it is. We're talking to companies who have it's had a really profound impact on their bottom line. Leaving a machine on when it doesn't need to be, leaving a light or an air conditioning on when it doesn't need to be, over the course of a year actually has a pretty profound impact on the bottom line. And by using the right data, it tells you where to start looking, where to take action.
And you need to be, there are two sides to this. On the consuming energy, you need to be able to monitor it. How do you monitor it? You could get the core power that's coming from everything, but that doesn't give you enough information to target specific areas. So then you need to start censoring up, specific machines, and then working out if it's that one that's drawing too much power. Then there is a flip side of all this that I think about when I think about sustainability, and it's actually the software that we build as well. If you flip it on its head, from an AI perspective, if you're building an AI model that is going to predict how much energy usage, and you need a lot of data to do that, so there's a lot of computational power. So then you've got it's a different machine, but you've got a computer, a server, whether it's in the cloud or not, running for X amount of time.
It's easy to forget, isn't it? I think especially when you're working in the cloud.
Yeah.
It's not the days where you got a server in the corner whirring away, getting hot, and you go, it's kicking out a lot of energy. It does feel like out of sight, out of mind, and it is, it's our responsibility, isn't it, to make sure.
Yeah, the companies Microsoft are doing things, with Azure Cloud, they've got their sustainability efforts that they're, sort of working towards. But I think it's still on the people who are building the software to make sure that it's, performant, and there's all sorts of things in the background that not just at the core in the actual manufacturing,
And are there different ways that you can visualise that data, and is that important?
Visualise it. It's arguably the most important bit. I think, we at Razor, we have that internal capability to do the UX and the UI design, and we don't just apply that when we're building, a piece of software or building a website. If we're creating a Power BI dashboard, it has to work well for the user. Everything eventually has to interact with a human, or else it's there's no point until we get back to AI and all that.
Yeah, I was going to say.
James Croft says not taking our job.
Not taking our job, but until it does, people need to be able to interact with it, understand it. It needs to be intuitive. Because otherwise, all the stuff, all the plumbing that's come before, that could be perfect. But if it ends up on a dashboard in an interface that isn't intuitive to use, that people just give up on, they're not going to take action, and you may as well have not done all that. I think it's something that is often an afterthought.
Yeah.
I think, especially with tools like Power BI or whatever you end up using it in, people can just throw something together because they think, okay, it's there's your graph, but it has a big impact on the actual impact that thing makes. So we always think about that first thing.
Imagine going down though from an innovation, little things whirring through my mind, going down the AI route. I'm not saying GPT could do this, but if you could ask GPT to create your dashboard, you tell it what you want. I want a pie chart that says this and infers from your data source. Imagine if we could do that though. If there was a tool out there, we could build.
Not taking jobs. Though.
Not taking jobs.
Yeah,
not taking jobs. We're taking our jobs. Making it.
I just love to see the cogs work, James.
It's something. The heat he's giving off.
Yeah, that's radiating. Terms like data warehouse and data lake. What's all that about?
Yeah, so they're both different things for different needs. I I think an important thing to point out is the difference between structured and unstructured data. And structured something that I think we're all very used to working with in business. You know, that's your spreadsheet. That's stuff that can sit in rows and columns, you know, numbers and whatever. Unstructured is your images. It's your PDF document, or basically everything else. And a data lake can do the lot.
Yeah, it just stores it.
So it throws everything in, like I say, in its raw format. And then the data warehouse is much more that. How can we put structured data in a way that we can query it and set it up for what we're asking? So to just blow your mind, there is a third option, which is a combination of the two. Can you guess what it's called?
Data.
It is
data warehouse.
A lake house. A data lake house is kind of the new. That sits somewhere in between that tries to both leverage that ability to have all kinds of data in a raw format, but then sitting on top of that is sort of a layer that you can interact with, and as if it was a data warehouse, if it was structured. So you can kind of change the focus from having that pipeline architecture to kind of having it all in one place, and that's something that we're seeing more and more of, particularly there's a lot of data to deal with. So it depends on the application, but often solutions have a bit of everything. Going back to that point about data scientists, that lake is mainly where they're working.
Yeah.
They want to work with things that are unrefined, because once it's been refined, you don't know what you've lost. You might be asking a question that the data that was going to answer it got cleaned out somewhere back over here. You're missing a trend. So all part of data solutions.
If data were a superhero, what would its superpower be?
If data was a superhero, what superpower would it be? I think probably the superpower that people often think it has is that it can predict the future. I think they think if we get if we throw some AI in there and set up our data warehouse, do all this thing, that we can ask it a question, we can start predicting everything that's going to happen 3 years out and make all the decisions then. Which is not what it can do. Nobody can do that. It's about informing your decision making as much as possible, so you can make better decisions. No one's ever always going to make the right decision, but it can make better decisions. So if it was a superhero, it would be able to predict the future slightly more often than a regular person, but still not to an extent where you could kind of put your money on it.
You got there. It's almost like you've had a chance to prepare for that.
Yeah, it's like I thought, what is a really insightful way of turning that question on its head a little bit.
It's just simple. Yeah. So, should we believe the hype then? Data.
Should we believe the hype of data?
Should we believe the hype? Data.
We should. I think, going back to my big pyramid, if I could just for a second go back to my...
Take it back to the triangle.
Take it back to the triangle. 3 shapes. We should... The hype of data, no. Data on its own is not useful. It's an overhead and something that you've got to pay to store and look after, and on its own doesn't do anything. The hype of turning that into real insight you can take action on, I believe the hype of that. That hype of trying to of elevating people, making people better, I believe the hype of that as well. So I think data, no, but the effects when used properly, I think there's some hype there to believe.
It's almost like unrefined oil.
Yeah, data is the new oil. Do you know the guy? The phrase "data is the new oil." The guy who came up with that is at Sheffield University.
Is that right?
Just up the road. So little claim to fame there, little factoid.
There you go.
Little soundbite.
Sheffield, home of data.
Home data. Yeah.
Well, Patrick, James, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
It's been most insightful, and I hope you enjoyed listening and watching. Until next time, goodbye.